They were not born criminals. They were trained soldiers. Elite Mexican commandos who abandoned their oath to protect and instead built an empire of terror. Known as Los Zetas, they became the most feared cartel in the world, ruthless, organized, and unstoppable. They didn't just traffic drugs, they declared war on anyone who stood in their way. Rival cartels, police, and even the government. Entire towns vanished, bodies hung from bridges, and fear became their greatest weapon. What started as a group of deserters turned into a brutal military-style cartel that changed Mexico forever. This is the untold story of Los Zetas, how soldiers became killers, how discipline became destruction, and how one cartel turned the entire drug war into a battlefield. Mexico's criminal underworld has always been violent, but when Los Zetas emerged, everything changed. Unlike other cartels that grew from drug dealers and smugglers, Los Zetas were born from the Mexican military's elite special forces, men trained to kill, to survive, and to win wars. In the late 1990s, a handful of commandos defected from the army and joined the Gulf Cartel as enforcers. Their mission was simple: protect the cartel's operations. But their discipline, military tactics, and ruthless efficiency soon made them far more powerful than their employers ever imagined. Within years, these soldiers had transformed themselves into a separate criminal empire, one built on fear, control, and absolute dominance. Los Zetas were unlike any cartel the world had ever seen. They didn't just fight rivals. They terrorized entire regions. They used psychological warfare, mass executions, and public displays of violence to send a message: no one is safe. From local police to journalists and politicians, anyone who stood against them paid the ultimate price. At their peak, Los Zetas controlled huge parts of Mexico, stretching their power into Central America and even the United States. But their greed and brutality also became their downfall. As leaders were killed or captured, chaos erupted within their ranks, turning the once united army into scattered factions of killers. This is not just a story of crime. It's a story of transformation. How a few soldiers turned into one of the most dangerous cartels in history, reshaping the face of organized crime forever. The story of Los Zetas begins in the late 1990s, an era when Mexico's drug war was rapidly escalating and the Gulf Cartel was fighting to maintain control of its lucrative smuggling routes along the U.S. border. At that time, the cartel's leader, Ociel Cárdenas Guillén, faced threats from every direction: rival cartels, federal forces, and betrayal within his own ranks. Cárdenas realized he needed more than drug dealers and street thugs to protect his empire. He needed soldiers, disciplined, fearless, and deadly. That's when he made a move that would change the course of Mexico's criminal history forever. He reached into the very heart of the Mexican military and began recruiting members of the Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, GAFE, the country's elite special forces unit trained by U.S. and Israeli instructors. These soldiers were experts in counterterrorism, reconnaissance, ambush tactics, and urban warfare. Among them was a man known as Arturo Guzmán de Sena, codenamed Z1. He would become the founding father of Los Zetas, the man who transformed a drug cartel's protection squad into a highly organized killing machine. When Guzmán and his fellow defectors joined the Gulf Cartel, they brought with them military precision, strategy, and advanced weaponry. They introduced structures similar to those of elite combat units: chain of command, intelligence gathering, encrypted communications, and rapid response operations. For Cárdenas, this was a dream come true. His cartel now had a private army, trained to kill, intimidate, and execute with surgical precision. At first, their mission was simple: protect the Gulf Cartel's leadership and eliminate rivals. But their effectiveness quickly elevated them beyond the role of mere bodyguards. They were the cartel's enforcers, assassins, and strategists, feared by enemies, and respected by allies. The name Los Zetas came from the radio code used by high-ranking officers in the Mexican military, symbolizing their origins and authority. Soon, Los Zetas began expanding their influence. They didn't just fight for the Gulf Cartel. They took control of territories, managed smuggling routes, and handled financial operations. Their brutality was unmatched. Anyone who opposed them was executed, not quietly, but publicly, to send a message. Their methods included beheadings, hangings, and mass killings designed to terrorize entire communities into submission. But power has a way of breeding ambition. By the early 2000s, Los Zetas had grown too strong, too independent. They started to see themselves not as soldiers for hire, but as rulers in their own right. Their leader, Guzman de Chena, Z1, envisioned a future where Los Zetas would control everything: drugs, weapons, money, and territory, without answering to anyone. That dream began taking shape after Z1's death in 2002. His successor, Heriberto Lascano, Z3, carried the vision forward with even more aggression. Under Lascano's leadership, Los Zetas evolved from a paramilitary enforcement wing into a full-fledged cartel. They began recruiting former federal police, local law enforcement, and even ex-soldiers from Guatemala's Caibiles, one of the most feared commando units in Central America. What made Los Zetas unique was their discipline and structure. Every member had a rank and specific function, from foot soldiers and intelligence gatherers to financial operatives and hitmen. Their operations were military campaigns, not random acts of violence. And this structure gave them an advantage over traditional cartels, who often operated on loyalty and fear alone. However, their rise also created enemies, not just among rival cartels like Sinaloa and La Familia Michoacana, but within the Gulf Cartel itself. The very organization that birthed Los Zetas began to fear its creation. Tensions grew as Los Zetas demanded more autonomy, more profits, and more control. By the mid-2000s, those tensions exploded into open war. The alliance between the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas collapsed, igniting one of the bloodiest conflicts in Mexico's history. What began as a security force designed to protect a cartel had now transformed into a militarized criminal empire, one that would soon rival the Mexican government itself in firepower, influence, and fear. From soldiers to mercenaries, and from mercenaries to warlords, Los Zetas had been born. Their reign of terror was only just beginning. By the early 2000s, Los Zetas had outgrown their role as the Gulf Cartel's enforcers. They were no longer just a security wing. They were a military organization running a criminal empire. Under the ruthless leadership of Heriberto Lascano, Z3, the cartel began to operate like an army of occupation. Their weapons were military grade. Their hierarchy was disciplined. Their strategy was pure domination. The early years of Los Zetas' independence were marked by rapid expansion. They moved swiftly across Mexico, capturing key smuggling routes that connected to the United States border. But unlike other cartels that relied solely on cocaine or marijuana trafficking, Los Zetas diversified. They created an empire that thrived on fear, control, and multiple income streams. They started taxing local businesses, controlling illegal mining, fuel theft, known as huachicol, extortion, human trafficking, and kidnapping. Their philosophy was simple. If it made money, it belonged to them. Every town, every highway, every business was subject to their tax, a form of criminal governance that replaced local authority. What truly separated Los Zetas from their rivals was their military structure. Every member had a rank. Orders came down from the top and were executed without question. Their operations were coordinated through encrypted radio networks and advanced surveillance systems. They trained recruits in military-style camps hidden in rural Mexico, where new members learned ambush tactics, interrogation methods, and weapon handling. Their psychological warfare was unmatched. They didn't just kill enemies, they made examples out of them. Public executions, bodies hung from bridges, dismemberments left on display, all carefully orchestrated to send one message: resistance means death. Fear became their most powerful weapon, and through fear, they ruled. As Los Zetas expanded, their control extended beyond Mexico. They forged alliances with Central American gangs, including Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and set up operations in Guatemala and Honduras, using their connections to secure smuggling routes for drugs and weapons. Their network became transnational, reaching deep into the United States through distributors and corrupt officials. By 2008, Los Zetas had become one of the most powerful and violent cartels in the world. Their reputation for brutality was so terrifying that rival cartels avoided direct confrontation whenever possible. Even the Mexican government feared them, not just because of their firepower, but because of their infiltration of local law enforcement and the military. They had eyes everywhere. Police chiefs, mayors, and soldiers were either on their payroll or too terrified to act against them. In some regions, Los Zetas became the law. They patrolled streets, controlled curfews, and decided who lived or died. The media, too, became a target. Journalists who reported on cartel activities were kidnapped, tortured, or killed. The message was clear: silence or death. It was during this time that the world began to truly understand the terror of Los Zetas. Their acts weren't just crimes, they were declarations of war against anyone who challenged them. Meanwhile, internal leadership became even more brutal. Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, Z40, known for his sadistic nature, rose through the ranks. He believed in violence as a means of control and fear as a business tool. His arrival marked a darker chapter in Los Zetas' history. Trevino introduced even more savage tactics: victims burned alive, rivals dissolved in acid, and mass executions that became headlines around the world. The profits were enormous, but the bloodshed was even greater. The Mexican government launched major operations to dismantle Los Zetas, but each time a leader fell, another emerged. Their decentralized structure made them nearly impossible to destroy. By 2010, Los Zetas officially split from the Gulf Cartel, declaring independence and control over their own empire. The separation ignited an all-out war across northern and eastern Mexico. Cities like Reynosa, Monterrey, and Nuevo Laredo turned into war zones. The battles were fought not just with guns, but with terror. Massacres, bombings, and mass graves became the grim symbols of their rule. Their rise was complete. Los Zetas had transformed from a handful of ex-commandos into a global criminal syndicate with operations spanning continents. But with their rapid ascent came growing paranoia, greed, and internal betrayal, the same traits that would soon lead to their bloody downfall. The empire built on discipline and fear was about to turn against itself. By 2010, Los Zetas had become more than a cartel. They were a terror machine. Their name alone inspired fear across Mexico and Central America. Towns, cities, and entire states were under their control. Their brutal rule was marked not just by violence, but by a kind of psychological domination that no other cartel had ever mastered. Los Zetas understood that fear could be as powerful as a bullet. They turned murder into a message. Rivals weren't just killed, they were displayed. Bodies were hung from bridges, dismembered corpses were left in city squares, and walls were painted with threatening graffiti, known as narcomantas. Every killing served a purpose: to remind everyone, citizens, police, and enemies alike, that Los Zetas ruled through terror. The world began to take notice after a series of horrifying events that shocked even Mexico's war-hardened population. One of the most infamous was the San Fernando massacres. In 2010 and 2011, Los Zetas intercepted buses carrying migrants hoping to cross into the United States. They kidnapped hundreds, demanding ransom. When many couldn't pay, they executed them, one by one. Nearly 200 bodies were discovered in mass graves, their hands tied, their heads shot. This massacre exposed the horrifying scale of Los Zetas' cruelty. They weren't just fighting rivals. They were exterminating innocents to send a message to anyone who dared to cross their paths or operate in their territory without permission. But their brutality extended far beyond migrants. They targeted journalists, politicians, business owners, and police officers who refused to cooperate. Their intelligence networks were vast. They had informants in every level of government, ensuring that anyone who spoke out would be found. Inside the organization, discipline was absolute, and punishment for betrayal was unimaginable. Traitors were executed in front of their comrades, sometimes forced to dig their own graves. Lascano, and later Trevino Morales, enforced loyalty through terror, making fear the glue that held the cartel together. However, that same fear began to tear them apart. When paranoia becomes a way of life, trust dies. And that's exactly what happened inside Los Zetas. Leaders began turning on each other, suspecting betrayal and disloyalty at every corner. Meanwhile, the Mexican government, under growing international pressure, launched a series of major operations to dismantle Los Zetas. Elite Marine units, backed by U.S. intelligence, began targeting key figures. Their first major victory came in 2012, when Heriberto Lascano, Z3, the cartel's founder and most disciplined commander, was killed in a shootout with the Navy. His death left a void that would never be filled. In his place rose Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, Z40, a man with no sense of restraint. If Lascano was the brain, Trevino was pure rage. Under his leadership, the violence became chaotic and uncontrollable. Trevino was obsessed with power. He ordered mass killings not out of strategy, but pride. His methods included dissolving victims in acid, burning people alive, and recording executions as warnings. The brutality that once served as a calculated tool of control now spiraled into sadistic madness. This unchecked violence drew the attention of every major law enforcement agency in the world. The United States labeled Los Zetas as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on Earth, placing them alongside global terrorist groups. Yet, despite the growing pressure, Los Zetas continued to fight back with military tactics. They ambushed police convoys, shot down helicopters, and attacked military bases. Some battles lasted hours, leaving dozens dead on both sides. But as more leaders were captured or killed, the organization began to fracture. Internal divisions grew between different factions, the old guard that still followed Lascano's disciplined methods, and the new generation under Trevino's reckless command. By 2013, Los Zetas were bleeding from within. Trevino's arrest by Mexican Marines was the final blow to their unity. What followed was a brutal civil war between splinter groups, each fighting for control over the remains of their once mighty empire. The fear they had spread for years began to consume them. Towns they once ruled descended into chaos, as former Zetas fought each other in endless battles for power. The military, rival cartels, and even civilians began to strike back. What had started as a disciplined army of ex-commandos had become a fractured network of killers, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and desperate. The empire built on blood was beginning to crumble. But even as their power faded, their shadow remained. The terror Los Zetas unleashed had permanently scarred Mexico, leaving behind a legacy of mass graves, broken families, and an entire generation haunted by violence. Los Zetas had risen higher than any cartel before them, and now their fall was just as explosive, just as bloody, and just as unforgettable. By 2013, the once mighty Los Zetas Cartel, once feared as Mexico's most powerful criminal army, was crumbling from the inside. What had started as an organized, disciplined group of elite ex-soldiers had turned into a fractured network of warlords, each fighting for control. Their leadership had fallen apart, their unity was gone, and their empire was bleeding from every direction. The death of Heriberto Lascano, Z3, in 2012 and the capture of Miguel Ángel Trevino Morales, Z40, in 2013 marked the beginning of the end. Without strong leadership, the organization splintered into multiple rival factions, each claiming to be the true successor of Los Zetas. The once carefully structured cartel became a chaotic battleground. Two main factions emerged. The Northeast Cartel, Cartel del Noreste, CDN, led by Trevino's brother Omar Trevino Morales, Z42, and the old-school Zetas, who still claimed loyalty to Lascano's disciplined methods. But this wasn't just a fight for leadership. It was a war for survival. Each group unleashed its own wave of violence to prove dominance. Cities like Nuevo Laredo, Monterrey, and Reynosa became war zones once again. Gunfights erupted daily, police officers were executed in public, and civilians were caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, the Mexican government intensified its assault. The Marina, Navy, and Sedena, Army, launched large-scale operations, supported by intelligence from the DEA and FBI. For the first time, Mexico's military had technology and coordination strong enough to track cartel communications and movements. In 2015, the fall accelerated when Omar Trevino Morales, Z42, was captured in a high-risk operation near Monterrey. The once feared leader was dragged out of his hideout without resistance, a symbol of how far the mighty Zetas had fallen. But the arrest didn't bring peace. Instead, it unleashed chaos. The power vacuum left behind by Z42's capture triggered a brutal internal conflict. Lower-ranking commanders turned against each other, forming smaller criminal cells that continued the Zetas' operations under different names. As the Mexican government dismantled their leadership, rival cartels saw an opportunity. The Sinaloa Cartel, CJNG, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and Gulf Cartel all moved aggressively to seize Zetas territory. The once dominant regions of Tamaulipas, Veracruz, and Coahuila turned into battlegrounds once more. By now, Los Zetas were no longer the organized, militarized cartel they once were. Their soldiers had become fragmented bands of killers for hire, each operating independently, surviving through extortion, kidnapping, and local control. The grand empire had collapsed into chaos. The government's campaign against Los Zetas was brutal and relentless. Between 2010 and 2018, thousands of arrests and military operations targeted every level of their structure, from high-ranking commanders to street-level operatives. Their financial networks were frozen, their safe houses raided, and their weapons seized. However, even as their leaders were captured or killed, the violence didn't stop. Instead, it became decentralized. The smaller Zeta splinter groups continued to terrorize border towns, but they lacked the hierarchy and discipline that once made Los Zetas unstoppable. The fall of Los Zetas also exposed deep corruption within Mexico's institutions. Investigations revealed that high-ranking officials, police chiefs, and even military officers had protected or cooperated with the cartel for years. The line between the state and organized crime had blurred, a reflection of how deeply Los Zetas had infiltrated Mexico's system. Internationally, their collapse was celebrated as a major victory in the war on drugs. But inside Mexico, the story was far from over. The tactics that Los Zetas had introduced, militarized violence, public executions, psychological warfare, had already been adopted by newer cartels like CJNG. In many ways, Los Zetas didn't just die. They evolved. Their soldiers, now leaderless, joined other cartels, bringing with them the same brutal methods that had once made their name infamous. By 2020, the original Los Zetas had ceased to exist as a single organization. What remained were ghosts of their former power. splinter factions still fighting for scraps of territory. But their legacy of fear continued to haunt Mexico. The mass graves they left behind, the burned-out towns, and the thousands of disappeared people stood as permanent scars of their reign. The fall of Los Zetas was not a clean victory. It was a collapse drenched in blood. Their leaders were gone, their power dismantled, but their influence remained woven into the fabric of Mexico's criminal landscape. The military had created them, the government had armed them, and in the end, it was both the state and the people who paid the price. Even after their empire collapsed, the legacy of Los Zetas refused to die. Their brutality had reshaped the entire landscape of organized crime in Mexico, and the world would never be the same again. The story of Los Zetas began with soldiers and ended with monsters. What started as a disciplined military unit had turned into a symbol of terror so deep that even rival cartels feared them. Their tactics, their ruthlessness, and their use of military precision in criminal operations changed the rules of the game forever. Even years after the downfall of their leadership, the echo of their methods continued to resonate across Mexico. Smaller splinter groups, like the Northeast Cartel, CDN, Old School Zetas, and Grupo Bravo, carried on their brutal legacy. Though weaker in structure, they inherited the Zetas' ideology of domination through fear. In cities like Nuevo Laredo and Reynosa, locals still whisper the name Zetas with dread. Even without official leadership, their presence lingers like a shadow, unseen, but always felt. Kidnappings, extortion, and executions continue, driven by remnants of the organization that refused to die completely. But the Zetas' influence extended far beyond Mexico's borders. Their military-style operations and transnational connections spread across Central America, reaching Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. They established networks for drug and human trafficking that became the backbone of modern cartels. International law enforcement agencies like the DEA, Interpol, and FBI recognized Los Zetas not just as a cartel, but as a paramilitary organization. Their recruitment of ex-soldiers, police, and mercenaries inspired a terrifying new trend in organized crime: professional militarization. This was their true legacy. Not just drugs or money, but a system of violence so efficient it blurred the line between war and crime. And yet, their story holds a dark irony. The same government that trained and armed them had also destroyed them. The same military structure that gave them power became their greatest weakness. When the leadership fell, the entire chain of command shattered, proving that even the most feared armies can collapse from within. For the people of Mexico, however, the wounds remain open. Towns once controlled by Los Zetas still bear scars, burned buildings, abandoned homes, and countless families who never found their missing loved ones. In places like San Fernando, where mass graves were discovered, the ground itself tells the story of their reign of terror. Over time, journalists and investigators risked their lives to uncover what really happened during the Zetas' rule. Some paid with their lives. The cartel had a strict policy: silence or death. Dozens of reporters were kidnapped, tortured, or murdered for daring to expose them. Even today, much of the Zetas' history remains hidden in shadows, locked behind fear, corruption, and silence. But one truth is undeniable. Los Zetas changed Mexico forever. Before them, cartels operated like businesses. After them, they operated like armies. Before them, criminals wanted wealth. After them, they wanted power. The psychological impact of their violence continues to haunt the nation. Communities live in constant fear, children grow up surrounded by death, and trust in law enforcement has eroded completely. The people have learned one bitter lesson: that even when the cartels fall, the violence remains. Still, amidst the chaos, there are stories of resistance. Families of victims, journalists, and human rights activists continue to demand justice. They refuse to let the crimes of Los Zetas be forgotten. To them, remembering is an act of defiance, a way to keep the victims' voices alive. In recent years, the Northeast Cartel, CDN, one of the Zetas' remaining factions, tried to reclaim their former glory. Led by new, younger commanders, they launched violent campaigns in Tamaulipas, targeting both civilians and police. But without the organization and discipline of their predecessors, they've become a ghost of what Los Zetas once were. Brutal, yes, but chaotic and desperate. Law enforcement continues to hunt the remnants of the group, but the real war is far from over. Because even if Los Zetas are gone in name, their DNA runs through every cartel that followed. The CJNG, Gulf Cartel, and countless others have adopted their methods: public executions, intimidation videos, and military-grade tactics. It's as if Los Zetas' ghost still walks the streets, teaching every new generation of criminals how to rule through fear. As one Mexican journalist once wrote, "Los Zetas didn't just destroy cities, they destroyed the illusion that we were ever safe." Today, when people speak of Los Zetas, they don't just talk about a cartel, they talk about a dark chapter of Mexico's history, one that revealed how close the line between the government, the army, and organized crime can be. Their